Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel are about men who came here chasing something they probably should have known better than to chase. A young girlfriend, a business opportunity, a fantasy. And look, we don't judge. Loneliness makes people do things they wouldn't put on a CV. But today's story is a bit different. The man you're about to hear from is Ciaran Doyle. He's 55. He's from County Roscommon in Ireland, and he spent 30 years as a power lines lineman for ESB Networks, the Irish electricity grid. Not a reckless man, not a romantic fool. Not someone who flew to Cebu chasing a woman half his age he'd met on Facebook. He came here the way a careful man does anything, with research, with spreadsheets, with a plan. And he still ended up in a place he never intended to be. Ciaran's story is one of the more quietly devastating ones we've heard on this channel. There's no single villain, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where the mask slips. It's something slower and, in some ways, harder to protect against. This one's going to stick with you. Here's his story, in his own words. I'll start with the job, because the job explains a lot about how I think. When you work power lines, real work, not office work, not a desk with a screen, you develop a relationship with consequences. If you rush a connection, you die. If you misread the conditions, you die. If you assume something is safe without checking it yourself, you die. 30 years of that, and it becomes more than a habit. It becomes the way you move through the world. Check twice. Read the conditions. Don't rush. I was good at the job. I was good at it because I never stopped respecting what could go wrong. The thing about that kind of discipline, and I've thought about this a lot since, is that it works perfectly well when the danger is visible, when it's a live wire in the rain, when it's a pole that hasn't been maintained. The danger is there. It's physical, and you can read it if you know what you're looking for. It works less well when the danger is a very gradual series of small, reasonable decisions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Una was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in 2015. She was 49. We'd been married 23 years at that point, lived in Athlone, had a daughter, Sinead, grown up by then, doing her teacher training in Galway. Normal life, then not normal life. I won't go into the details of the 6 years that followed. Not because it's too painful, though it is. More because anyone who's cared for someone with a degenerative illness knows what it is. And anyone who hasn't probably can't quite picture it from the outside anyway. It's relentless. That's the word. Relentless in a way that changes your body. I lost 1.5 stones without trying, and in a way that changes how you understand time. You stop thinking about the future in any real sense. There's only today and what today requires. I took early redundancy from ESB in 2019 to care for her full-time. Thought long and hard about it. Didn't regret it. Still don't. Una died on a Tuesday in February 2021. I'd been expecting it for months, and was still not remotely prepared. The house in Athlone, we'd lived there 18 years. I sold it 8 months later. I couldn't be in it. I don't mean that as a dramatic statement. I mean it as a practical one. I'd walk into the kitchen to make a cup of tea, and the whole room would just... It wasn't a house anymore. It was a record of something that had finished. So I sold it and moved into a rented flat in Mullingar. Which is not exactly the romantic next chapter anyone would write for themselves, but there it is. I had 158,000 euros in an account. The house, the pension lump sum, a life insurance payout. More money than I'd ever held in one place. And I want to be honest about this. I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. I was 54 years old, with a body still calibrated for hard physical work, a pension coming in monthly, a daughter who rang on Sundays, and nothing whatsoever to maintain. That's the bit that doesn't get said enough, I think. People talk about grief like it's the main thing. And it is, for a while. But then grief starts to go quiet. It doesn't go away. It just goes quieter. And what's left underneath it is this: the absence of purpose. I wasn't depressed. Not clinically. I just didn't know what a retired lineman does with his hands when there are no more lines. I found the Facebook group at about 2 a.m, which is, I suspect, when most decisions of this type get made. Retire Early Philippines, 11,000 members when I joined. Men from all over, mostly British, Irish, Australian, American, posting photographs of sunsets over Cebu and meals that cost €3 and going on at length about which mobile network had the best 4G in the provinces. It had the feel of a club. A slightly disorganized, occasionally argumentative club, but a club nonetheless. Men who'd found a thing and wanted to share it with other men who might need it. I read through it for about an hour that first night. The posts were mostly practical. Visa questions, apartment costs, which hospital in Cebu was reliable for what. Occasionally there'd be a warning about someone who'd had a bad experience, which paradoxically made the whole enterprise feel more credible, not less. Like they were self-policing, responsible about it. And then I came across a post from a man in Waterford. I don't know his name. He hadn't written much, just a sentence or two. Something along the lines of, "Came here 2 years ago not expecting much. It's given me back a reason to get up in the morning." I read that 3 times. I want to be clear about what I did next, because I think it matters to the story. I didn't book a flight on a romantic impulse. I did what a lineman does before he touches anything. I researched. I read about the SRRV, the Special Resident Retirees Visa. Understood the broad strokes of it. I looked up cost of living calculators, cross-referenced them with forum posts from men who'd actually been living there. I watched YouTube videos. And yes, before anyone asks, I probably watched channels not entirely unlike this one. I made a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, on my laptop at the kitchen table in Mullingar, with projected monthly costs and pension income and a buffer calculation that showed my €158,000 lasting well into my late 70s at the numbers I was seeing advertised. It was a good spreadsheet, thorough, properly formatted. I was proud of it. The spreadsheet had columns for rent, food, transport, healthcare, visa costs, and miscellaneous. It did not have a column for inflation. It did not have a column for emotional decisions. And it did not have a column for what it costs, in ways that aren't financial. When you spend too long being the answer to other people's problems, because being needed is the only thing that makes you feel like yourself again. But I didn't know that yet. I booked a 3-week exploratory trip to Cebu City for March 2023. Not Boracay. I'd read that was for people 20 years younger than me, and I had no interest in proving that wrong publicly. Not Manila. Too big, too loud. I'd have spent the whole time disoriented. Cebu because it had proper hospitals, a functioning expat infrastructure, and a flight from Dublin via Dubai that I could manage without changing planes 4 times at my age. I landed at Mactan Cebu International at 6 a.m. and walked out into heat that hit me like a physical thing. Not the aggressive wet heat of a bad Irish summer. Something else entirely. Warm in the way warmth is supposed to work. Full and even and everywhere at once. I stood outside the terminal for a moment, just stood there, which I'm sure looked odd, and tried to work out what I was feeling. I think I was feeling warm. Just that. After a very long time of not feeling much of anything, I was standing in heat, and it felt like something. I know how that sounds, but I hadn't felt warm in years. And I don't just mean the weather. The taxi from the airport was a white Toyota. They're all white Toyotas. And the driver had a small Santo Niño on the dashboard with a rosary looped around its neck, which I would later understand was not unusual at all, but at the time struck me as charmingly specific. He asked where I was from, and when I said Ireland, he said, "Manny Pacquiao, Irish fan," which I thought was a creative connection, but didn't argue with at 6 in the morning. The condo I'd booked was in Mactan, the island the airport sits on, connected to Cebu city proper by 2 bridges. Short-term rental, furnished, 5th floor, advertised at 28,000 pesos a month, which was about 450 euros. Not luxurious, but clean. A sliding door opened onto a small balcony with a view of another building and, if you craned slightly, a strip of the Mactan Channel. I stood on the balcony in the early light and listened to the neighborhood wake up. There was a rooster. There is always a rooster. This one had the confidence of an animal that has never once been told it was too early. By 6:30, I was walking. I'd looked up the Opon Public Market, the old wet market near the town center, because someone on the Facebook group had mentioned it specifically as the place to understand what things actually cost. They were right. The stalls were already full by the time I got there. Vendors selling kangkong, green mangoes, dried fish laid out in rows, whole chickens hanging in ways that would give a Tesco buyer a cardiac arrest. A woman sold me a breakfast of sinangag, that's garlic fried rice, with 2 eggs and a small portion of tocino, which is a sweet cured pork, and a sachet coffee mixed in a plastic cup. I sat on a low plastic stool at a folding table and ate the whole thing for 90 pesos. That's less than €1.50. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't doing maths. I was absolutely doing maths, but it wasn't just the maths. It was the activity of the place. The specific, purposeful noise of a market that is getting on with it. Vendors calling out, motorcycles threading through pedestrians, a child being told off in Cebuano, someone laughing very loudly about something 2 stalls over. After a year and a half in a quiet flat in Mullingar, this was, I want to choose the right word, bracing, like a cold shower, except warm. I walked for 3 hours that first morning, past the basketball court near the market, where 3 teenagers were already playing despite the heat. Past the sari-sari stores just opening their shutters, each one a tiny kiosk, selling everything from shampoo sachets to Red Horse in small bottles. Past a church, Santa Rosa de Lima, where morning mass had just ended, and a cluster of older women in floral dresses stood outside talking with great seriousness about something. Past a Jollibee that was, inexplicably, already operating at full capacity. The first few days, I did what tourists do, more or less. I took a grab to SM Seaside City, which is the big mall on the south side of Cebu City, mostly because I needed a local SIM card from a Globe store and couldn't work out another way to get one. I walked along the Mactan waterfront in the evenings. I ate at a carinderia near the condo where the woman who ran it looked at me with the expression of someone who had seen many Canos sit at her tables and had well-calibrated expectations of the whole enterprise. And I felt, not happy exactly, I want to be accurate here, but present. I was in my body in a way I hadn't been in quite some time. The heat demanded it. You can't be distracted in that kind of heat. You have to pay attention to where you are. The second evening, I rang Sinead, my daughter, told her I'd arrived fine, that it was warm, that the food was good. She said, "Da, are you actually going to do this?" And I said I was just having a look. There was a pause that contained a great deal of information. She said she just wanted me to be careful. I told her I was always careful, which was true, and also, I now understand, somewhat beside the point. The things that would happen to me in the Philippines were not things that carefulness could have caught on a normal day. They required a different kind of attention, the kind you develop from understanding not just the physical conditions, but your own internal ones. And in that department, I was not, at that time, in great shape. But I didn't know that yet. Day 3, the water heater stopped working. Not dramatically. It just produced cold water with great conviction and no apology. I rang the number on the rental agreement, and about 40 minutes later, a man appeared at the door who introduced himself as Ronnie, the building manager. He was perhaps 50, slight, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the easy competence of someone who has fixed this particular problem many times before. He looked at the heater, said something in Cebuano under his breath that was probably not complimentary toward the heater, and fixed it in about 20 minutes with a small tool he'd brought without being asked. Then he apologized for the inconvenience in a way that was so genuinely warm and slightly formal that I felt embarrassed to have rung in the first place. He mentioned, while packing up his tool bag, that one of the other residents had had the same problem with that same unit 2 weeks ago. Sorted it herself, he said, with evident admiration. I made some remark about that being impressive, and Ronnie, with the manner of a man who enjoys a natural segue, said he could introduce us if I liked. She was in the car park most mornings and was very used to helping new residents find their feet. I said that would be fine, not particularly expectant one way or another. And that is how I met Gloria. She was standing beside a silver Mitsubishi, keys in her hand, in the act of leaving for work. Ronnie introduced us in the car park with the brevity of a man who had done his good deed and needed to get on. Gloria Reyes, 44. She looked at me with a directness that I found immediately less alarming than I probably should have. Not unfriendly, just not performing anything. I asked, because I needed to say something, whether she'd like to get a coffee sometime. She said she didn't drink coffee, but she knew a place for breakfast if I was up early. I said I was always up early. She said she'd knock at 6:30 the next morning then, and got into her car and drove away. I stood in the car park for a moment after she left, in the heat, slightly surprised at how efficiently that had been arranged. The next morning she knocked at 6:25. She was wearing work clothes, neat, practical, and she walked at a pace that suggested she had a schedule, and was doing me a favor by including me in it, which was accurate. She took me to a turo about 10 minutes away on foot, a small place with 4 tables and steam rising from pots behind a glass counter. And we ate arroz caldo, rice porridge with ginger and garlic and a hard-boiled egg. And she asked me, without preamble, what I had done for work. I told her. Power lines. ESB. 30 years. She said her late husband had been a welder, that she had more respect for men who worked with their hands than for men who sat in offices pretending the numbers they moved around were real. I thought about that for a second. Then I thought, I am going to extend this trip by 2 weeks. I didn't say that out loud, but I was thinking it clearly enough that it might as well have been said. We had breakfast 3 more times before my original 3 weeks were up. Always that same turo, always early, always her choice of what to order. She had a system with the woman who ran the place, pointed at 2 or 3 pots, said something brief in Cebuano, and a few minutes later food appeared that was always exactly right. I never once saw a menu. I don't think there was one. She paid her half every time. Firmly. Not as a point being made, just as a thing she did. I noticed it. Filed it away. We talked about ordinary things, mostly. She asked questions about Ireland that weren't the questions tourists ask. Not about pubs or the cliffs of Moher, but about the electricity grid, about whether the rural areas were well served, about how the work had changed over the decades. She had a practical intelligence that reminded me, more than once, of the engineers I'd worked alongside at ESB. People who wanted to understand how things actually functioned rather than what they were supposed to look like. At some point during the second breakfast, she mentioned Maritis, her daughter. 21, second year of nursing at Cebu Doctors University, serious about it, good marks. Gloria said this without particular emphasis, just information being shared, the way you'd tell someone the relevant facts. I asked if she lived with her. She said no. Maritis had a room near the university during term, that she was a serious girl who didn't need watching. There was something in the way she said it, a pride that was also a kind of relief. The pride of a woman who'd raised someone capable of standing on their own. I extended the trip by 2 weeks, told myself it was because I hadn't finished evaluating Cebu properly, which was true in a way that was also not the main reason. We saw each other 5 more times in those 2 weeks, twice for breakfast. Once she took me to the carbon market in Cebu City, the big one, chaotic, incredible, where you can buy everything from live crabs to second-hand power tools, because I'd said I wanted to see the real commercial center of the place, and not just the SM malls. We walked for 2 hours in the heat and the noise, and she identified things I couldn't name, and occasionally stopped to argue good-naturedly with a vendor about a price with the ease of someone who had been doing this her whole life. At no point did she flatter me. At no point did she ask about my financial situation, or my house, or what my pension amounted to. She talked about her work, the logistics company, a difficult contracts manager, a shipment to Mindanao that had been held up for 3 weeks for reasons nobody could fully explain. She complained about Cebu traffic with genuine feeling. She recommended a Mercury drug branch that was reliably stocked, as opposed to the one near the waterfront, which often wasn't. And at some point during the carbon market visit she said, not looking at me, watching a man load sacks of rice onto a tricycle, that she had no interest in a man who wanted a servant, that her late husband had not treated her as one, and she had no intention of arranging her life differently for anyone's convenience. I don't know what prompted it. We hadn't discussed anything that would obviously invite such a statement. I think she was simply establishing terms, saying the thing plainly so it didn't need to be said again later. I told her I'd never had any interest in that arrangement either. She nodded as if that was settled and bought a kilo of green mangoes from the stall in front of us. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other moment in this story, because it was so exactly the thing I needed to hear, at exactly the time I needed to hear it, that I should probably have been more suspicious of it. Not that she was lying. I don't think she was lying. But a man who'd spent 6 years as someone's primary carer, someone who'd structured his entire life around being useful rather than being pleased, that man hears, "I'm not looking for a servant," and understands it as, "I am not going to take advantage of you." And those two things are not the same sentence. I flew back to Dublin the last week of March. The flight was 14 hours with the layover in Dubai, and I spent a lot of it looking at my phone, which had a WhatsApp notification from Gloria before I'd even boarded, asking if I'd arrived at the gate without trouble. We fell into a routine quickly. She messaged in the morning, not a good morning, with a row of hearts, just something factual, the way she talked in person. Traffic is bad today. Maritis passed her pharmacology exam. There is a typhoon near Samar, but nothing to worry about in Cebu. I responded. We moved on to longer conversations in the evenings when it was late afternoon for me in Mullingar and early evening for her in Cebu. She asked once what I'd had for dinner, and I told her I'd heated a tin of soup, and she said that was depressing, and suggested I learn to make sinigang, which she described as impossible to make badly, which I believe is an exaggeration, but not a large one. 3 months of this. No asks, no emergencies, no escalating emotional declarations, just two middle-aged people talking across 12 time zones about the ordinary texture of their days. I'm aware of how it sounds to say, I found this moving, but I did. After 6 years of crisis, 6 years of hospital appointments and medication schedules, and Una's good days and worst days, and the relentless requirement to be present and alert and on. The sensation of a conversation that required nothing except attention was remarkable. She didn't need me for anything. She was simply talking to me. Because she wanted to. I think that was the thing I misread most completely. Not because it was false, but because I turned it into evidence. Proof that this was safe, that this was different from the stories, that this was a person who valued me for something other than what I could provide. And I used that conviction to stop asking questions I should have kept asking. I think about the first call where she mentioned Mauritius's university fees in passing. Not a request. A fact, offered as context while she was talking about something else. The logistics company, I think, or the traffic, I can't remember exactly. She mentioned there was a shortfall for the second semester, that she was looking at options. I offered before she finished the sentence. I want to be clear about that. She did not ask. I offered, and she accepted, with a thank you that was genuine but not excessive. Not the elaborate gratitude of someone who'd been waiting for the opening. Just a quiet, that would help. Yes, thank you, Kiaran. And we moved on to something else. 180,000 pesos, roughly 3,100 euros. I transferred it via Remitly that same week. I told myself it was a contribution to a young woman's nursing education, which the world needs more of. Which was true. I also told myself it was no different from helping a niece with fees, or a neighbor. Which was also, in some limited sense, true. What I didn't tell myself, what I didn't want to examine, was that it felt good. Not the giving exactly. The being asked, even obliquely. Being the person who could solve the problem, who could make the shortfall disappear with a transfer that took 4 minutes and cost me roughly 2 weeks of my pension. I knew, somewhere at the back of it, that I was beginning something. A pattern of a particular shape. But the pattern felt like generosity, not obligation. And generosity is a hard thing to argue yourself out of when you've spent so long with nothing to give. I went back to Cebu in September 2023. 6 weeks this time. I told Sinead it was to properly assess whether I wanted to live there long term. She said, right, duh, in a tone that suggested she had already reached her own conclusions about the situation but was choosing not to share them. I rented a larger condo in Mactan. Same building, different unit, 1 floor up, a proper sea view this time rather than a suggestion of one. 34,000 pesos a month, which was about 550 euros. I noted briefly that this was almost 10,000 pesos more than the 25,000 pesos figure I'd seen discussed repeatedly in the Facebook group. I attributed it to the specific unit, rather than to any broader trend. I did not update my spreadsheet. Gloria and I had, in the 3 months of calls, moved into something more clearly a relationship, though neither of us had said so outright. When she met me at the airport, she'd insisted, said it was practical, she had the car. There was a moment in the arrivals hall that settled the question without requiring any words. She brought a flask of coffee for herself and a bottle of cold water for me because she'd remembered, from a passing remark 3 months earlier, that I didn't drink well on flights. That kind of attention. The specific, unglamorous kind that means more than any declaration. We were comfortable together quickly. She showed me neighborhoods I hadn't found on my own. A good wet market in Mandaue, closer than the open one, and better for vegetables. A bake shop in Lapu-Lapu that opened at 5 in the morning and made pain de sal that was still warm at 6. She had an ordered, competent relationship with her daily life that I found genuinely restful to be near. 2 weeks in, her mother had a cardiac episode. Gloria rang me at 7 in the morning, already at the hospital. Chonghua in Mandaue, which she explained was the right place for cardiac cases in this part of Cebu. Her voice was controlled, the way competent people's voices are controlled in emergencies. But I could hear the strain underneath it. Her mother was 71, had been complaining of chest tightness for a week, that Gloria had been trying to get her to take seriously, and had finally agreed to go to the hospital when the pain woke her in the night. 2 nights, stents, medication ongoing. The bills arrived in stages, as they do. Gloria showed me without my asking. I want to say that clearly because it matters. I asked to see them, and she produced them without hesitation, without drama, without any of the evasiveness that might have indicated she was managing what I saw: hospital admission receipts, surgical fees, pharmacy costs, the cardiologist's consultation, everything itemized, 420,000 pesos in total across the hospitalization and the medication regime the doctors sent her home with. That's roughly 7,200 euros. It was real. I have no doubt about that. The hospitalization was real. The diagnosis was real. The bills were genuine. I want to be clear about this because what followed can be misread as exploitation, and that's not quite the right word for it. Gloria's mother had a genuine cardiac emergency. Gloria was genuinely stretched to cover it, and I genuinely chose to help. What I didn't understand, yet, was what that choice meant within the framework of the family, how it would be received, what it would establish, what it would signal about who I was and what role I was playing. The dinner happened the following Sunday. Gloria's mother was home by then, resting but mobile. The dinner was at the family house in Mandaue, a solid concrete home on a quiet street, not large but well kept, with a small garden at the front where someone had grown tomatoes against a wire fence. Gloria's 2 sisters were there, her brother Rolando, who I was meeting for the first time. A compact man in his 40s with a motorbike parked outside and a firm handshake. A nephew of about 12 who had been tasked with performing something and took this responsibility very seriously. I was seated at the head of the table, not asked, seated. It was done with a naturalness that suggested it had been decided in advance, which it had been, though no one said so. There was adobo, sinigang, pancit, lechon kawali that someone had clearly gone to some effort to obtain. San Miguel on the table, though I noticed nobody pushed it on me. A fruit salad in a bowl that was manifestly a special occasion item. The nephew performed a song, something in Cebuano, earnestly delivered, to warm applause from the family and genuine bafflement from me, which I hoped I concealed adequately. Gloria's mother sat to my left. At some point during the meal, she reached over and took my hand and said something in Cebuano, looking directly at me while she said it. She had the unhurried dignity of a woman who has lived long enough to mean exactly what she says. Gloria translated it as, "God sent you." I didn't know what to do with that. I'm a Catholic in the way most Irish people of my generation are Catholic. It's there, it's real, but it's quiet. It doesn't come out much. But I understood the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't thanking me for money. She was placing me within a framework where my presence in her daughter's life and the help I'd given was understood as providential, as something with meaning beyond the transactional. I knew, somewhere, that I was being thanked for money, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like being seen, like being recognized as a person of a particular kind, a person who shows up, who doesn't look away from difficulty, who can be relied upon. And after 2 years of being nobody's anything, of existing in a flat in Mullingar as a man the world had no particular use for, that recognition went somewhere very deep. I think about that dinner a lot, the way the chair was already placed at the head of the table before I arrived. Somebody carried it there and set it in position. That's not a criticism. It's hospitality, genuine and considered. But the chair was there before I was. The role existed before I sat in it. I didn't have the vocabulary for that observation then. I do now. Rolando walked me to my grab at the end of the evening. We shook hands again. He said I was good for Gloria, that the family could see I was a serious man. He said it like a compliment. It was a compliment. It was also, I understand now, an assessment. The kind you make when you're trying to work out the load-bearing capacity of a structure you're planning to use. But I drove back to Mactan that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, more like usefulness. Like I had weight and substance in the world. Like there was a reason, a concrete and human reason, for me to be where I was. A man who spent 6 years caring for someone he loved, who understood his entire worth through the prism of being needed. That man does not question the feeling of being needed again. He just settles into it, the way a body settles into a familiar shape. I should have asked more questions about the family's finances, about what they expected, about what the dinner meant, in their terms, not just mine. I didn't. I went home and booked flights back to Cebu for February. Christmas in Galway was fine. Sinead had done the house up nicely. She always did. And there was a nephew's christening on the 27th, which gave the whole visit a shape and purpose that I appreciated. I brought pasalubong from Cebu, dried mangoes, some local biscuits in a tin with a picture of a beach on it. Sinead's husband Padrig looked at the tin and said, "Very exotic. Kiaran," in the way people from Galway say things when they're being polite about not knowing what to say. I didn't take offense. I probably wouldn't have known what to say either 2 years ago. What I noticed, sitting at Sinead's kitchen table on St. Stephen's Day, eating leftover turkey, was that I was already thinking about when I'd be back in Cebu, not as a holiday destination, as home. Ireland felt, for the first time, like the place I was visiting. I didn't say this to Sinead. She'd have worried, and then she'd have researched, and then she'd have printed out articles, and she has enough to be dealing with between 2 small children and a job. So I nodded along to conversations about planning permission and local schools, and kept my own counsel, which is something I've always been moderately good at. I flew back to Mullingar on the 3rd of January, and by the 8th I had made the decision formally. I was retiring to Cebu. The question was now administrative. I went back to the SRRV. Really went back to it this time, not just the overview. The Philippine Retirement Authority website is not, if I'm being honest, a model of clarity. But I found my way through it. The deposit requirement for someone my age, 55 at point of application, was $20,000, held in a PRA-accredited bank. Theoretically returnable when you permanently depart the Philippines and surrender the visa. Processing time, approximately 14 months. I had done research. I want to say that again. I read the PRA website. I read 3 forum threads about the process on the expat groups. I watched a YouTube video made by an Australian who had completed the application and documented each step with the enthusiasm of a man who had found his purpose in life. The video was 41 minutes long, and I watched all of it. It covered the deposit, the bank procedures, the documentation requirements, the waiting period. What it did not cover, or what I did not adequately absorb, and I'll own that, was the clause about the deposit being non-withdrawable except upon permanent departure and formal visa surrender. I understood the deposit was held. I understood it was returnable in theory. I did not fully reckon with what held meant in practice, that this was not money I could access in an emergency or draw on if costs ran higher than expected, or use for anything at all while I remained in the Philippines. It was, functionally, frozen. For as long as I lived there. I wired 20,000 US dollars, approximately 1,100,000 pesos, or 18,900 euros at the rate that week, to the PRA-accredited bank account in January 2024. I began assembling the documentation. Pension verification letter from ESB's HR department, authenticated by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. Apostilled, that's a specific form of international certification, and sent to Manila. Birth certificate, passport copies, medical clearance, a photograph that met specific requirements the instructions described in painstaking detail. I was told by the PRA agent I corresponded with via email that processing typically took 14 months from the date of deposit confirmation. I flew back to Cebu in February 2024. I signed a 12-month lease on a condo, a different building this time, slightly further from the water, 32,000 pesos a month, about 515 euros. Better value. I opened a local bank account at a BDO branch on the main road in Lapu-Lapu, which took 2 visits and more documentation than I had expected, but was eventually accomplished. I bought a second-hand bicycle from a man 2 streets over because the grab costs were adding up, and I wanted, in some basic way, to feel like I lived there rather than like a tourist with a longer-than-usual booking. Gloria and I formalized things. She started staying over most nights. I met Marites properly. Not the passing introduction at a family gathering, but a real conversation, over a dinner that Gloria cooked at the condo. Marites was 22 by then, in her final nursing year, quieter than her mother and more watchful. She studied me across the table with a seriousness that I found both slightly daunting and oddly reassuring. A young woman paying attention. She asked about my work, same as her mother had. She seemed to find the answer satisfactory. So I had a home, more or less, a relationship, a lease, an application in process. And then Rolando came to see me. He came on a Saturday morning in March, while Gloria was at her mother's. I made coffee. I'd found a brand I liked, Baracco, strong enough to do actual work. And we sat at the small table on the balcony, and he laid out the situation. 3 tricycles, already operating on routes around the Lapu-Lapu area. A route permit coming available through a contact in the city transport office. The kind of opportunity, he said, that didn't stay available. A hotel group in Mactan was tendering contracts for staff transport, and the formalized business would be positioned to bid. He needed 680,000 pesos, which was roughly 11,700 euros, to purchase the permit and cover the registration costs. He had a document, a loan agreement, he said, witnessed, notarized, with a repayment schedule. He slid it across the table. I read it. I read it carefully, I thought. Checked the figures, the repayment terms, the monthly amounts. There was a notary stamp on the bottom. I didn't ask whose notary. I should have asked whose notary. It was, I later established, a cousin who was studying law. Not yet qualified. I remember thinking, clearly and with full awareness, This is exactly the kind of thing I told myself I wouldn't do. I had told myself, in Mullingar, reading forum posts about men who'd lent money to family members of Filipino partners. I had read those posts and thought, not me. I'm not that man. I understand the risk. And then Rolando sat across from me, and the tricycles were real, and the hotel contract opportunity was real, and the document had a stamp, and I had money, and he was Gloria's brother, and I'd eaten at his family's table, and I had 6 reasons why this was different. I lent it. I transferred the money that afternoon via GCash. I went back inside and made another coffee, and did not open the spreadsheet. The 14-month mark came in March 2024. I noted it on a Tuesday, the same way I'd note a scheduled inspection that was overdue. Sent a polite email to the PRA contact in Manila. Received a reply 4 days later that said my application was progressing and I would be contacted regarding next steps. I was contacted 6 weeks after that. The format of my ESB pension verification letter did not conform to the PRA's required template. The letter I had obtained from ESB's HR department, authenticated by the Department of Foreign Affairs, apostilled at considerable inconvenience and expense, was not in the correct format. The correct format was specified in a document I was now sent, which I was fairly certain had not been available on the website when I had originally applied. I emailed ESB's HR department from Cebu at 11 in the morning, which was 3 in the morning in Ireland. They responded the following afternoon, Irish time, with reasonable efficiency and some confusion about what exactly was required. It took 3 emails to establish the correct template. The new letter took 2 weeks to produce, another week to authenticate, another 10 days to apostille and courier to Manila. Total elapsed time, 6 weeks. The PRA acknowledged receipt, told me the application would now be completed in approximately 8 to 10 weeks. I marked the date on my calendar and said nothing to anyone. During this period, all of it, from the February move-in through to the endless waiting, I was living on tourist visa extensions. This is how it works. You enter on a 30-day tourist visa, extend it at the Bureau of Immigration to 59 days, then extend again to a further 29 days, which brings you to a maximum of 59 days per entry without leaving the country. After that, you leave, re-enter, start again. Or, if you prefer to stay continuously, you use the extension system, which theoretically can keep you legal for up to 3 years, but requires you to physically appear at the BOI office every month or 2 months, queue, pay, and wait. The BOI office in Cebu City is on Osmeña Boulevard. It opens at 8. I arrived at 7:45 on my first visit and was 14th in the queue. The process took 2.5 hours, cost 3,100 pesos, about 50 euros, plus a discretionary amount for a fixer who sidled up at one point and offered, with practiced discretion, to expedite proceedings. I did not use him the first time. I used him the 3rd time, because by the 3rd time, I understood that some queues in this country do not move on their own. My projected monthly cost had been 45,000 pesos. My actual monthly cost was running at 71,000 pesos. The difference, roughly 420 euros a month, came from everywhere and nowhere. The condo at 32,000 pesos instead of the advertised 25,000 pesos. The visa costs, grab fares because I hadn't budgeted properly for how far things were from each other on an island without a reliable jeepney route I'd worked out yet, eating out more than I'd planned, small amounts, constantly, adding up in the way that water adds up in a badly maintained trench. And Rolando stopped mentioning the loan. Not dramatically. He didn't become cold or evasive or difficult to be around. He was at the family dinners. He was cordial. He fed me well whenever I visited. He asked after Sinead. he'd remembered her name from something I'd mentioned once, and I found this simultaneously touching and, in retrospect, notable. But the 680,000 pesos, the repayment schedule with its neat monthly figures, he simply didn't raise it. The first time I mentioned it, casually in the car park after a Sunday lunch, he said he was working on it, that the route permit had taken longer than expected to process through the city office, that the hotel tender had been delayed. All plausible. All things I had no way to verify. The second time, I raised it with Gloria. She said he was working on it and changed the subject. The third time, I raised it with Gloria again. She said the same thing. He was working on it, with a slight flatness in her voice that suggested she was tired of being the person in the middle, and that she had not expected to be asked a third time. I wrote off the loan, not in any formal sense, just internally. The money was gone, and I knew it was gone, and pressing the point would cost more than the money in ways that were harder to quantify. In June, Maritis's final nursing year fees came in. The last semester, clinical placement, uniform, equipment, board exam registration, 210,000 pesos, about 3,600 euros. Gloria told me about it in the evening, at the condo, while we were eating. She didn't preface it with apology. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry to ask again." She said, "The situation is, Maritis needs her fees before the 15th, or she loses her clinical placement." And then she looked at me. It was a reasonable statement of fact. Maritis was real. The nursing program was real. The deadline was real. I paid it. But I noticed, filed away, the way a lineman files away a reading that's slightly off normal, that the language had changed. The framing had shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. It was around this time that I started going to a bar on one of the side streets off the main road in Lapu-Lapu. Nothing special. Plastic chairs, San Miguel in bottles, a ceiling fan that worked about 60% of the time, a TV showing basketball with the sound off. I'd been avoiding it because I'd told myself it was the kind of place where bitter expats went to tell each other the same 5 stories. Which is partially true. But I was beginning to understand that the stories had information in them that I needed. There was a Scotsman named Alistair, retired civil engineer, Aberdeen, had been in Cebu for 8 years. A Dutchman called Peter, who'd taught secondary school in Rotterdam and now taught English in Mandaue, quietly, without the work permit he was legally required to have, which he mentioned with the casual openness of a man who had stopped worrying about the particular risks he was taking. A Canadian Dave, who ran a small dive school out of a beach resort in Mactan and had the leathered look of someone who spent a great deal of time in salt water. We compared notes without comparing notes. That's the only way to describe it. Nobody said, "Let me tell you what happened to me." We just talked, and in the talking, patterns emerged. One evening, Alistair, who was not a dramatic man, used a phrase I hadn't heard before. Utang na loob. He explained it without condescension, the way an engineer explains load distribution to someone who hasn't studied it, but needs to understand why the bridge is cracking. It is, he said, a debt that lives inside you. Not a financial debt. A debt of the self. When someone does something significant for your family, the obligation to repay it, not necessarily in money, but in loyalty, in access, in continued goodwill, becomes structural. It doesn't expire, and it flows not just to the individual who gave, but to whatever they represent. He said, "It's not a scam, it's a system. The problem is you walked into it thinking you were a guest, when they'd already given you a job title." I sat with that for a while, long enough that Peter bought another round, And Dave got up to look at the basketball score, and Alistair let the silence be, the way Scots sometimes do. I went home and read about Utang na Loob for 2 hours on my phone. Lying on the bed in the condo with the ceiling fan on. Read about OFW culture, the millions of Filipinos who work abroad specifically to send money home, who are understood by their families not as individual earners, but as a collective resource, a structural solution to the family's ongoing financial condition. Read about how a foreign partner fills that same structural role, not because the family is cynical, but because that is simply what the role means. The role exists. The role has obligations. The person in the role fulfills them. I didn't feel betrayed. That's the thing I want to say clearly. I didn't feel cheated or manipulated in any simple sense. I felt clarified, like a reading that had been blurry finally resolved into focus. The family had not invented a version of Ciaran Doyle that served their purposes. They had simply placed him in a vacancy that already existed, and he had stepped into it with both feet because stepping into vacancies was, for him, what feeling alive felt like. That was the hardest thing to unknot, and I was only beginning to try. The SRRV card arrived on a Wednesday in October 2024, 16 months after I'd wired the deposit. A small laminated card with my photograph and a reference number and the words Special Resident Retirees Visa printed on it in the font of a document that has been officially processed by a government department that processes many documents. I held it for a moment at the kitchen table and felt approximately nothing. The $20,000, the 1,100,000 pesos, the 18,900 euros, sits in a PRA-accredited bank account in Manila. It will be returned to me when I permanently leave the Philippines and formally surrender the visa. I am not leaving. So the money is, in practice, as useful to me as if it were on the moon. I am the legal holder of a Special Resident Retirees Visa and the practical holder of a frozen asset I cannot touch for as long as I remain the legal holder of a Special Resident Retirees Visa. There is a circularity to this that I found, on the Wednesday in question, almost admirable. I put the card in my wallet and went for my morning walk. That weekend I sat down with a notebook. Not the spreadsheet, a notebook, because I needed to write it by hand to make myself actually read the numbers, and did a full accounting. This is what I had come with. 158,000 euros. This is where it went. The SRRV deposit, 18,900 euros, frozen. The university fees across 2 payments, Marites' second and final semesters, 6,600 euros. Gloria's mother's hospitalization and medication, 7,200 euros. The Rolando loan, which I was not going to see again, 11,700 euros. Monthly cost overruns across 18 months of living in Cebu. The gap between my projected 45,000 pesos and my actual 71,000 pesos month after month, approximately 14,000 euros. Flights back to Ireland twice, Christmas 2023, and a brief trip in August when Sinead asked me to come for a family thing I didn't want to miss. 3,400 euros. Miscellaneous. The pasalubong I brought whenever I visited the family. The Christmas decorations I bought for the condo because I made it nicer than I needed to. A second-hand motorbike I purchased in May and sold at a loss in August because the traffic frightened me. 8,000 euros. Total spent or frozen, approximately 70,000 euros. Remaining accessible funds, 68,000 euros give or take, with the SRRV deposit locked out of reach. I sat with those numbers for a while. Then I made a coffee and sat with them some more. It is not catastrophic. I want to say that plainly because I think catastrophe is the wrong frame. My ESB pension comes in every month. €1,480 after tax, which at current rates is approximately 92,000 pesos. My monthly costs, now that I have the SRRV and no longer pay visa extension fees, run at about 68,000 pesos on a careful month. I have 68,000 euros in accessible savings as a buffer. If Cebu's costs don't rise faster than my pension adjusts, I can live here indefinitely without touching the buffer. If they do, I'll have some decisions to make. But I'm not destitute. I'm not broken. I'm a 55-year-old man who came to a foreign country with more money than he'd ever had and less self-knowledge than he thought. And he has less of the money now and somewhat more of the self-knowledge. On balance, that might be a reasonable trade. I haven't decided yet. I talked to Gloria the following Sunday. Not a confrontation. I've never been a man who does confrontations particularly well, and in any case, it didn't feel like a confrontation was what the situation required. It was a conversation, a plain one. I told her I could no longer be the financial answer to every situation the family encountered. That I understood, now. I used the phrase, utang na loob, and she looked at me carefully when I said it. What my role had become, and that I didn't resent it. Because I had walked into it of my own accord, and kept walking into it, because it felt like something I knew how to do. But I was not an OFW. I was not a bank. I was a man on a fixed pension with a finite buffer. And the buffer was more finite than either of us had acknowledged. She listened. She didn't cry, didn't argue, didn't negotiate. She said she understood, that she had hoped it wouldn't need to be said. I've thought about that sentence a great deal. Whether it means she knew and had been waiting for me to reach my own limit, or whether she had simply assumed, in good faith, that I would keep saying yes because I always had. I genuinely don't know. Both things are possible. Both things might be true simultaneously. This is a country where saying things plainly is not always the custom, where problems are navigated around rather than addressed directly. And I am a man from County Roscommon who was raised to believe that if you have something to say, you say it, and if you don't say it, you have accepted the situation. We are, in that respect, not well matched for the kind of conversation I was trying to have. She is still in my life. I'm not sure how to characterize it beyond that. Complicated. Probably my own fault for not drawing lines earlier, when lines would have been easier to draw. We still have breakfast sometimes at the Turo Turo, still early, still her choice of what to order. She still knows which Mercury drug branch to use. She still doesn't drink coffee. These things haven't changed. I came here looking for a way to stop missing Una. What I found instead was a way to be busy enough not to notice it for a while. There's a difference. I'm old enough now to know what it is. The practical things, for anyone watching who is thinking about any version of this, the retirement, the SRRV, the relationship with a Filipino woman and her family. Here is what I would say plainly, as one practical person to another. Read every SRRV clause before you wire a cent. Not the overview, not the YouTube video. The actual document, the actual conditions, the actual definition of returnable. The money is real, and the conditions are real, and the processing time is real, and none of it is as straightforward as the forums suggest. Never lend money in the Philippines under a document notarized by a family member. Just don't. Understand utang na loob before you sit at the head of anyone's table, before you cover the first hospital bill, before you offer, before you're asked. The framework exists whether you know it exists or not. Better to know. And budget for the Philippines as it actually is, not as it was in the Facebook posts from 3 years ago. The mangoes cost the same. Everything else has gone up. I still walk to the market at 6 in the morning. The stalls are full by the time I get there. There's always a rooster. I buy whatever looks good and bring it home and cook something from it, because I learned to cook here, eventually, out of necessity and then out of something approaching enjoyment. The mangoes are still good. I find this oddly comforting. Evidence that some things don't compound against you. That's Kairan's story, and on behalf of Inside the Philippines, we're grateful he was willing to tell it. There's a version of this story that's easier to tell. The version where there's a villain, a scam, a moment of dramatic betrayal. That story is satisfying because it has a clear lesson and a clear target. Ciaran's story doesn't have those things, and that makes it, in some ways, harder to protect against. He arrived here carrying grief, carrying a lifetime's habit of being useful, and carrying more money than he'd ever managed before. He met a woman who was genuine and who also existed within a family structure that had a role waiting for him. A role he stepped into willingly, repeatedly, because it was the only role he knew how to play well. The Philippines didn't invent that vulnerability. It just found it. Gloria is not a villain. Rolando is not a criminal, technically. The SRRV is a legitimate visa with legitimate complications that a man who reads carefully might have understood better than Ciaran did. The failure here, if failure is even the right word, was a mismatch. A man who hadn't done his grief work meeting a family obligation system he hadn't learned to read, at the exact moment in his life when saying yes felt better than saying anything else. If you're planning a Philippines retirement, the SRRV documentation checklist is linked below, put together with people who have been through the process and know where the gaps are. Use it. If you're in an early-stage relationship with a Filipina and the family's financial needs are already arriving faster than you can think about them, that's not automatically a red flag. It's a cultural reality. The question is whether you've had the conversation, in plain language, about what you can and cannot sustain. Have it early. Have it sober. Have it before you're at the head of anyone's table, with someone's mother holding your hand, telling you God sent you. This has been Inside the Philippines. We'll see you in the next one.